talking about what God requires of us. What God requires of us. I'm reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. 1 Corinthians 4, 1 and 2. Let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. Amen. Any person in authority requires something from his or her subordinates. For example, the coach requires that his players come for training, and that the time that they are supposed to train, everybody must be available. He also expects that they be technically and tactically disciplined when he teaches them technicalities of the game. Much the same way, God also requires that we walk in certain standards and we perceive ourselves in certain standards and from his perspective. And that is what the apostle talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. I will take the verse 1 and 2 and speak about what God requires of us. As believers and as Christians, God requires that first of all, we live a life of accountability. A life of accountability. Apostle Paul, in talking about himself and Apollos, he says that let a man so account of us, or let a man consider us as servants of Christ. So he's saying that don't just look at us as certain leaders. Don't look at us as people with titles, but consider us as servants or as ministers of Christ. So as servants of Christ, it means that you have a master and that you are answerable to him. You are accountable to him. If he is saying that let men consider he, the Apostle Paul, and Apollos, then he say as ministers, then he is saying that they have a master they are accountable to. So God requires that we live a life of accountability. We must live a life that is answerable to him. We must imagine ourselves as ministers, as servants, as people who God has called us in Christ Jesus unto service. So we live a life of accountability. Like every subordinate will account to a master. That is how we are supposed to live. We are supposed to make our lives. We are to show forth ourselves as people of accountability. Accountability brings to mind a sense of responsibility. It means that we are responsible. We are responsible to a one who have called us. So God requires that we live a life of accountability. In our part of the world, even in student politics and in general politics at large in our nation, when you read people's manifesto and you read from posters and billboards across, you see that a lot of people want to say that they will be people of accountability. So you see somebody vying for a position who will write under his poster probity and accountability, or service integrity accountability. He wants to say that he will live a life of accountability because he's in he wants to be given a position of trust. So Apostle Paul is saying that let men consider us, let men account us, or the church in Corinth to see he, Apostle Paul and Apollos, as ministers, as servants of Christ. They are people who live a life of accountability. They are accountable or answerable to a one who have given them a position of trust over the church in Corinth. In the previous chapter, in chapter 3, where the people were in confusion and they were fighting, he came in to tell them that, see, through the grace of God, I planted the church. Apollos came to water what I have planted, but the increase comes from the Lord. So we are just ministers, we are just servants. It is not Paul who did it, it is not Apollo who did it, but someone higher than us who have given us a position of trust. And he requires that we live a life of accountability. So what God requires of us is a life of accountability, a life that is answerable to God. It brings to us a sense of responsibility. So we must know that God requires that we live a life of accountability. Finally, God requires that we live a life of faithfulness. In verse 2, he says that, moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. God has not called us only to be successful. He has also called us, and he requires that we be faithful. Be faithful in the things that he has given us. And be faithful in the graces and the gifts that he has given us to serve. So, we must live a life of accountability because we are ministers or servants of Christ. We must live a life of faithfulness because we are stewards of the mysteries of God, as Apostle Paul puts it here in 1 Corinthians 4:1. So God requires that we live a life of faithfulness. In the parable of talents, when the master came, he called all the 3 servants to give account of what they were given. The 2, he told them that they were faithful servants, but the one who did not work with the talent he was given, he says that he was a wicked and lazy servant. So it suggests that God requires that we become faithful people. We live an honest life. We work with the right motives and become faithful with the things he has given us, or the things opportunity in life has granted us. We must be faithful with it. So God requires a life of accountability and a life of faithfulness from us. We must live a life of accountability because from the scriptures we see that we are servants of Christ or ministers of Christ. We must live a life of faithfulness because we are stewards, we are caretakers, we are stewards of the mysteries of God. God has entrusted the work in our hands. We must be faithful with it. We are servants, we must live a life of accountability. When we do these things, God is going to bless us. Ladies and gentlemen, God